Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Humanities, SOH, Master's Degree Programs, Master of Arts, English, MEG 06 American Literature, Block-1 Contexts of American Literature, Unit-2 The Consolidation and Dispersal of the Puritan Utopia, 2.0 Objectives. The aim of this unit is to represent the structure of the Puritan town in New England as that of a projected communal utopia. The focus of study will be the Puritan elites' efforts to highlight the spirit of unanimity within the community in order to obscure the fictions and fractions that frequently threaten to disrupt its unity. Various factors contributed towards the dissolution of the collective identity which the Puritans sought so assiduously to cultivate. Not the least of the factors was the emergence of trading interests which involved attempts to link the economy of the Puritan town with that of the world beyond. Gradually, new and manifold forces of dissent started to operate from the margins against a mainstream notion of Puritanism. The unit will indicate the complex modes through which some of these forces succeeded eventually in diluting, if not destroying altogether, the utopian aspirations of the New England Puritans. 2.1 The Puritan town as a projected communal utopia. The historian Robert Kelly has astutely stated, Virginians settled as individuals upon the land they received from the Crown. New Englanders settled as communities upon land granted to each village by the General Court, the legislature of Massachusetts Bay Colony. In New England, individuals got land only from the village, and then only if they were members of that community. That is, they would be looked over first by members of the village leadership to see if they were godly, if they were true Puritans. Then they would sign the covenant, common agreement, which the founders of the village had drawn up together at its founding. This covenant bound all people living in the town to fear and reverence Almighty God and profess and practice one truth, the foundation whereof is everlasting love. Each town, the term refers to a large piece of territory, not just to the village at its core, might be hundreds of thousands of acres in extent. The founding villages, however, turned their backs on that vast wilderness and formed compact village communities devoted to producing the perfect Christian life. All townspeople accepted the community's moral authority and discipline. According to the number of persons in each household, their social standing, and their usefulness in either church or commonwealth of their patriarch Puritan life was profoundly rooted in male dominance. As echoed in the Old Testament, the town would grant so much pasture lands in the commons, so many strips of arable farming land, and so much woodland. Everything was done communally. Just as each person's inaugural life was properly under the general observation of the overseeing group, so the cattle were grazed under the supervision of a common herdsman, and what was planted in the fields was decided upon in common and plowed and harvested in the same way. New England towns were almost entirely self-governing, and no me in them had to pay quittance to any overlord for their lands, in contrast to the colonies in the South, where annual quittance had to be paid to the proprietors or to the crow. Land, once granted to the individual farmers by the town, was theirs in fee simple, they owned it absolutely. The Puritans were determined never to reproduce, in their part of America, the ancient curse of tenant farming, which existed as the general rule in England, that is, the rule of manor lords who could raise rents and evict tenants at will. Just as Puritans wanted no bishops over their churches and their religious lives, they wanted no lords over their properties and their secular lives. Several days a week the townspeople would gather in the Mexican house to hear sermons from their minister. Each congregation was an independent CCX committee. There was no hierarchy that bound them together with other congregations. Higher basis of admission to any congregational community would be the ability of an individual to publicly and in detail describe the agony and the ecstasy of having gone through a Salvaborn experience. Congregationalism, in short, was a church of saint% built around a vision of Christian perfection. Visible faith and a visibly faithful way of living, these, it was said, were clearly the marks of God's grace in the saved person. Then, after grave inquiry, the selectmen who would govern the town were elected from the community. It was assumed that henceforth these individuals ultimately answered only to God. To point to unanimity as the motive for an integrated community, the Puritan village, wherever located, was defined by an enthusiasm for unity, order, and peace. New England was not founded, as is a popular misconception, as a democracy in the modern sense. People were supposed to talk together and argue things out in the town meeting house, but when decisions were made, all were to assent unanimously. In practice, Puritans accepted that certain individuals were more substantial and authoritative than others, and the board of selectmen elected from this elite was generally presumed to exercise a divine magistracy that should be obeyed dutifully. Indeed, Puritans generally disliked what we would call democracy, which implies free and open criticism of leaders and the organization of opposition to depose them. This was seen as running against the oneness desired by God and being disruptive of harmony. The idea of dissension, of a kind of party politics, within the village community, was beyond grasping or accepting as right. Were they not people of one God? Was there not one truth in all things? Unanimity, this was what New Englanders aimed for and prized. Anarchy and chaos were feared. What did New Englanders think about the relationship between state and church? On the one hand, they rejected the idea that church and state should be unified in the sense that they should be interwoven. Back home in Old England, the Church of England shared in the making of laws. Its bishops sat, and still sit, in the House of Lords, and it had a court system that could punish people by even incarceration for moral offenses. The Puritans wanted none of this, and they gave their ministers no such function or powers. However, Puritans were not what were then termed separatist radicals who demanded an absolute separation of state and church. Rather, they believed that in a given country there should be a single state church, supported by public taxes to which all citizens of the country should belong. We must remember, once more, that the Puritans believed deeply in unanimity, in the whole community thinking and acting in unison in every respect. 2.3 The emergence of trading interests as a factor undermining the unity within the Puritan settlements. The immediate task in New England was to find an economic basis for the new community. The money that emigrating Puritans brought with them sustained Massachusetts through its early years. Meanwhile, a frantic search for furs was under way. By 1640, this search had pushed settlements out to Connecticut, south along Long Island, and north to the Merrimack River. However, the supply of furs in New England was limited. By 1660, the trade had dropped off steeply. By 1675, it was virtually extinct. Was yet the outbreak of civil war in England in 1642 reduced immigration to a trickle, and with it the flow of money from England. Thereafter, Massachusetts entered extremely difficult times. A lasting source of income was found in the rich fishing waters that lay off the coasts of northern New England and Newfoundland. Steeped in minerals and nutrients, the mix of cold Arctic waters and the Gulf Stream in this region generated a huge fish population and therefore fertile fisheries. These waters had provided fish to French and Portuguese traders for generations, but after 1640 New Englanders moved in so vigorously that within 20 years they dominated the trade. The codfish became the Massachusetts symbol, for it provided the basis for a healthy New England economy. The consequence was the emergence of an extensive and elaborate trading system in the Atlantic, based upon fish, lumber products, rum, wine, tobacco, English manufactured goods, and eventually slaves. It touched England, West Africa, the Caribbean islands, the southern colonies in America, and New England. Through this trade, New England became closely embroiled in the slave traffic. In 1643, the first New England vessels carried a cargo of black slaves to the plantations. As this intricate new trading network emerged, an ascendant class, the merchants, arose in Massachusetts. The Puritan authorities were not traders, but were usually drawn from the lesser rural gentry in England. They were firmly moored to the traditional medieval conception that business activities should be engineered so as to benefit the general community and not just particular individuals. Controversy soon broke out in Massachusetts over whether merchants could raise the price of goods when the demands of the market allowed them to do so. The medieval injunction, issued at a time of stable prices, was that every article has a just tag. Higher rates were nothing but exploitation of the buyer. Robert Keene, a Boston merchant, who insisted on selling imported goods at higher prices than those decreed by the General Court, was tried and fined for his offense. As trade enlarged, these early troubles evolved into a continuing internecine conflict between the Puritan authorities, backed by the rural villagers all over Massachusetts, and the increasingly assertive and aggressive merchants of Boston. The merchants had emigrated directly from the crowded business districts of London. They knew each other intimately, intermarried extensively, and shared the business values of an increasingly individualistic age. They soon became men of importance in New England, for they exported iron goods, cloth and other vitally necessary manufactured goods of England. Suave and articulate, tending to be always on the side of social mobility and religious tolerance, they introduced into New England life and influence Puritans, regarded with alarm. Many of them wore foppish London dresses, which to Puritan eyes were scandalously sinful. By 1660, New England's merchants were trading freely all over the Atlantic with France, Spain, and Holland, among other countries. After the restoration of monarchy, Charles II's government moved vigorously to pull the New England merchants back into line and to tighten the reins on the empire. In the Navigation Acts, the royal authorities required that most colonial trade be channeled through England. These regulations brought loud complaints, but London was determined. Simultaneously, New England merchants began trooping to Whitehall, headquarters of government in London, to complain of the harsh restrictions imposed on them by the Puritan authorities in New England. They pointed to laws against the residence of strangers and the requirement of a salvation experience as the basis for admission to the community. Few merchants were saved. Many, indeed, had converted to Anglicanism, especially since Anglicans were back in power in England. Moved by their complaints, London began in 1665 the first of several investigations into the problems of New England. To the royal authorities, Puritans were hardly objects of sympathy. As suspected partisans to the anti-royalist revolution in England, which had been responsible for the execution of Charles I, they were treated almost as traitors to the homeland. Thus, in 1684, not surprisingly, the English crown came out openly in favor of the anti-Puritan forces and pronounced Massachusetts a royal colony. From then on, the governor of Massachusetts was not elected locally from the Puritan gentry, but almost invariably chosen in London from among English politicians. The governor administered the colony in company with the powerful upper house of the legislature, the council, which was composed of the various officials of the Massachusetts government, themselves appointed by the governor. They were often chosen from the merchant class, now completely victorious over the Puritans. At the same period, an Anglican church was opened in Boston and all discrimination against Anglicans were removed. The Bible Commonwealth had finally been undermined. 2.4 The Puritans against themselves. The Beginnings of Dissent Within the Fold of Puritanism. Dissensions within the Puritan fold were in part responsible for hastening the end of the projected Puritan Utopia in New England. In 163-1, Roger Williams had arrived in Boston to be a minister. He was soon preaching that no church, not even New England's Congregational Church, would be supported by general taxation, nor should everyone be required to attend it. Inevitably, he had to leave, and in 1636 he founded his own colony, Rhode Island. Here he created a unique community in which there was complete freedom of conscience and genuine democracy of institutions. Williams believed that only people's actions, and not their thoughts, should be supervised by government, and then only if they led to the harm of others. If they wished to gather together and form churches, these should be totally self-supporting and not connected to the state. That is, the gathered worshippers should be Baptism, and Baptist Protestantism in America has its origins in Roger Williams' Rhode Island. Gradually, Rhode Island attracted discontented religious individualists from all over New England. Puritans regarded it with distaste, for Rhode Island seemed to emblematize a licentiousness and lasciviousness that they found hard to accept. The secular heterodoxy represented by Anne Hutchinson, however, was even more startling. Born in 1591 and immigrated to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1634, when she and her husband joined the Puritan minister John Colton and his followers in the fledgling colony. In New England, the outspoken Anne, who had been deeply influenced by her father, a preacher imprisoned several times for his opposition to the established church, quickly ran afoul of the colony's basic distrust of women. When she realized that women were to be excluded from colonial affairs, she began holding meetings for women to discuss both religious and secular matters. Her strongly expressed belief in the individual soon attracted the merchants of the colony, who also chafed under the authoritarianism of the Puritan regime, clerical as much as lay, and in her acolytes consistently came into confrontation with the authorities, opposing wars with the Indians, fighting against the concept of Eve-induced original sin, upholding the separation between church and state. By 1637, Anne had a larger appeal than Governor John Winthrop. Brought to trial for her dissenting views, she found a forum to address the entire colony, England and posterity. During the trial, she was labeled a witch, a Jezebel, and compared to the lustful Eve. Convicted, she was banished from the colony and finally ironically murdered in exile by Indians. 2.5 Summary. In this unit, I have tried to highlight the structure of the Puritan town in New England as that of a projected communal utopia. This utopian projection is seen as an attempt on the part of the Puritan elite to gloss over differences and dissensions that existed within their community. A major factor of disruption of the integrity of the Puritan community stemmed out of the community's opening up to trading interests and, thereby inevitably to the world outside itself. Slowly but steadily, this induced divisive elements to assert themselves against a hegemonic interpretation of Puritanism. An account of these elements which ultimately dispersed the Puritan consolidation is also provided in this unit. Thank you. Subscribe to our channel for more updates, and we will see you with the next chapter.